right. That's a fun joke. The computer's dead. So, anybody sitting on an iPhone charger? No. All right. Oh, see? There is someone who is, which is lovely. So while Emily is saving my computer, let's just pray really quickly, huh? So, God, we thank you for the ability to gather together, to explore our faith together, to exist in community together. Pray that you would continue to move your spirit through this room as you have been all morning. And we're incredibly grateful for it. In your name we pray. You just doing it for me, then? For now. Well, we're in an impasse here. Do I focus more on the computer or everything happening here? And we're going to go with the people, right? Because this thing's never dead. Not once since I bought it last February have I allowed this computer to die before. And today is that day, everybody. So, which is quite in line. So, today we're talking, I'm doing the Am I Okay, right? And when Ray asked me, first I was like, we're a little early. May is usually when you call me in for the Mental Health Awareness Month stuff. And then we didn't talk about it for like 2 weeks. So I had like a bazillion notes, most of which are in here. So it turns out like I really needed the memo. And one of the things he wanted me to do was like give like concrete next steps, right? And I was like, yeah. I was like, hey, wait a minute. How do I do that? Right? My whole shtick is that my concrete, quote, next steps are because I've met with a person individually, gotten to know them and assess them, right? And in some kind of way as a human. And then put that against like the knowledge that I am supposed to have, right? So everything is highly individualized, and I can't possibly do that with everybody here. So there is a mix of like mental health is still something I'm going to like kind of always be a proponent of, but also maybe there's just some ways spiritually and that marry the world of psychology in a way that can make us consider where we're at a little differently, and if we can say, am I okay? One of my first issues is that okay in and of itself means like 20 things to 20 different people, right? I use it a few ways, Hey, Ryan, you okay? And one of which is, yep. And that means move on. I'm uninterested. I don't want to talk. Sometimes, in the most true ways, I am okay. I'm processing. I'm in stuff like we all are, but I'm okay because of whatever, people, the work I've done in my life, my relationship with Jesus, whatever it may be. And sometimes I'm very much not okay, but I've been not okay enough to know that I will end up just fine once I get through a particular stretch. And then that, in and of itself, is entirely subjected to the human being going through it. My threshold for nonsense and what would make me say I'm not okay is pretty high. And that's based off my own life story, right? That's based off my own traumas and experiences. Whereas somebody else might say, you're not okay. And I'm like, well, if we were to change the experiences, yeah, I would be not okay. But I have a higher threshold because of, trauma, which we all have, right? So, and then there's a mission, and then there's knowing yourself. So last week we had Doug speak, right? And he, for those of you who were here, it was just this incredibly moving story of his hospitalization with COVID, right? And as a pastor would and should, it was delivered in an encouraging way. And I was kind of like marveling at that after the fact, and I was like, how did he get there? So I'm only bringing him up to highlight a few things, and one is that a lot of time passed. He was in the hospital for a long time, and then there was time from when he was released from the hospital to when he came to us. In that is a mountain of processing, right? Of fear, of doubt, right? We get a nice condensed 30 minutes and go, miracle, right? And there are movements like that with God, and then there are the things that we apply miracle to after we've been able to process and see, because when we're in it, we can't, right? So That was a highlight, and so was his faithfulness, that choice, right? Because it's not a given. He made a choice repeatedly, over and over again, and sometimes probably wasn't making the choice himself at all, right? So I want to highlight that, and then I will move on to some terms we're going to throw up behind me, if they're there. Nice, thank you. All right, so why does Ryan make definitions? Well, one is I've been told I assume people know what I'm talking about all the time, right? There's that. Two, words shift, right? Big time. And we're in an age where we then just redefine words as they work for us as well, right? So these are themes that kind of stick throughout this whole talk. So I was like, let me get these up front so I don't have to keep like grabbing at them. So vulnerability is exposing oneself to harm, physical or emotional. Everybody's on board with that? Sounds like a really good time, right? Except we say vulnerability like it is like, I just want people to be vulnerable, right? And I just need him or her to be vulnerable with me. And it's like, it sounds nice. It's also dangerous, right? And there's a reason why people are reluctant to do so. Acceptance, the action of consenting to receiving something offered. What struck me with that one is that I had nothing to do with me until I looked at what was offered, as opposed to how I hear it the most, which is like, well, you just need to accept it. And I'm like, well, I was offered a pile of poop, and now you just want me to be like, this is great, thank you, right? So the acceptance is maybe only my responsibility after I've learned something else about it, right? Hence, the cognitive dissonance, which will lead to another thing I just want to clear up quick. So cognitive dissonance being the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitude change. So a lot of words to say that belief A and belief B are like magnets, like remember science class, and you can't make them meet, and all that force in between we experience emotionally, mentally, physically, right? So this is incredibly important when we're engaging anything in the world of change, because you come in with a whole fabric of pre-existing beliefs, and they are being challenged daily, right? So it's a constant thing, hence my referencing the time and choice, right? Because we can continue to choose to do that, right? The only way to really work out cognitive dissonance is I either reduce the importance of one part of it, I reduce the whole thing, or I change my beliefs, which is not something you can snap into effect. So, for example, we walk into church for the first time, we experience this whole thing, and you're hearing things that you're going to believe, should believe, hope to believe, whatever the case may be, and often they clash with what you already know. It's like uncomfortable experience, right? So I say that because also we then use the word perspective a whole heck of a lot, right? And now in the realm of pop psychology, right, the stuff you get on your Instagram feed, right, like everything's just like, just be positive, right? Just be positive. So where I work, perspective is incredibly important, but the whole purpose of it is to evaluate how it's based in a reality, right? So it's not, hey man, that boss that did that to you, or this job that's horrible for you, just be positive. No, it's like, hey, actually, sounds like you're evaluating this clearly, that it could be a terrible job. Maybe you need a change, right? Not that I'm going to explicitly say make a change, but if you are evaluating something in your own life, you know best, essentially, right? Where we look at perspective is, am I coloring this reality with anxiety, fear, depression, right? Is my, quote, presenting mental illness or struggle what is coloring my perspective? It's not just slap on the rose-colored glasses and everything's going to be fine. So that also implies for me that just reading that stuff isn't going to get me there, right? Every day just like slapping on a positive attitude. But we juxtapose that with what I might say up here, right? And this is why I'm clearing it up, because I will say things like, hey, even if you don't feel this way, we sing these songs because we're getting this biofeedback, right? You may not feel joy, and we're singing a song about joy, but just singing it gives us and our brain a chance to hear it, right? And we're doing it together, so there's a collective comfort, right? And some people are like having an experience, you're like, what about me? Right? Like, And I don't get that. If you ever see mist in my eyes, know I'm weeping, right? That is as expressive as it might get for me, unless things are really, really bad, right? And like 4 people in my life will see that. And that's just a form of acceptance for me, right? That's just who I am. It's okay. But the scope of these things, again, I'm just trying to point to this. Everything has a level. Everything has a gradient. This stuff is not binary or black and white. I would argue that even we come here because Jesus presents and is the only one I can think of that presents a clear image of perfection, right? Like he knows exactly who he is. He behaves in such a way. He does not apologize for it. He does not explain himself. He does none of such things. He doesn't need someone to go like, hey, Jesus, good job, man. You know, he's like, I'm going to fall on that now. He just does his thing, right? Because he knows exactly who he is. There's a reason why we're attracted to the model, right? Like, we can't be that because we are not static. Who I am now is not who I was 10 years ago, and I will not be the same person 10 years from now. Some form of me will remain true. The reason why like delving into psychotherapy made sense for me was I was able to identify kind of like themes, as if I was like reading my own book and writing an English paper on it. I had to identify my themes. And when I did, I was able to build a perspective and a worldview and define integrity in my life and all of these things. So when life gets crazy and I'm running and everything's falling out of my pockets, I know what to pick up and keep it moving. So we're clear on the terms, I think. I have belabored that enough. So I mentioned the pop psychology because there is one guy I actually seem to respect, and his name is Phil Stutz, and he's an integrative, see, that's what I'm talking about, integrative psychotherapist. And what he does is he takes these things from other areas and puts them together in a way that any of us could really understand. If you heard the guy talk, it's completely unassuming, as if you could have learned this like anywhere. Comes from years of experience and a pretty brilliant mind. So there's a few things that he brings into his view of psychotherapy that I'm going to bring in here. But he has a quote that I think we need to keep in mind on slide 3, which is, you have 3 aspects of reality that nobody gets to avoid: pain, uncertainty, and constant work. Those are things you're just going to have to live with, no matter what. What will make you happy is the process. You have to learn how to love the process of dealing with those 3 things. And I was like, well, Phil, I agree with you up to the love part. But he's right? Because none of us are free of pain, right? None of us are free of uncertainty. It's only our own desires that we tell ourselves we can predict outcomes, right? Like, it's just a trick. We're not machines. You know, you can play with a machine and accurately predict. We cannot, right? How to love these things comes from one of the terms, and I think vulnerability is one of the key ones, and so is acceptance. And you may have heard me very recently just really like, I hate the process, right? I'm so resentful of always having to be put into a position of challenge, of letting go, of growing, or as the Stoics say, like the obstacle is the way, right? So the path that feels the least safe is always the one that's right for me, right? And that's been decided for myself via tons of psychotherapy, right? Because my story and my traumas equal, I really value just enough and predictability and safety, right? And these things are to scale. Because I've had nothing and nobody, I now will compromise all for that, right? That's my, like, not doing well thing. But it looks good, right? The flip is true, right? When I was stepping out into doing a business that I didn't want to do a year ago, but felt like I had to, everybody in my life had an MBA, right? All of a sudden, all the people are like, Ryan, you're doing great. We're like, have you considered this? And I'm like, oh, when did you go to Harvard? You know, like, I watch Shark Tank too. Like, we're all right. Like, this is going to work out. But if I don't engage this process, I'm never going to get anywhere. And I don't like it. Ask my wife, right? She knows. But I had a nice moment with that when she said, you've been faithful. And I was like, have I? Because in here, I have not felt such thing. And that is the just dissonance of following Jesus sometimes, right? Like, you don't have time to do the best thing or pull back and make the good choice. I've had a 12-hour day. I'm going home. I want to be a dad. I want to be a husband. I want to be present. And these are like a bunch of things I'm not very good at after talking to people for a bunch of hours. I want to check out and dissociate, right? Knowing that part of myself allows me to work around it and to ask for grace, right? So constant uncertainty and constant work. And that work we define in a way that is about ourselves. This isn't like a death and taxes kind of a conversation, right? This is like you are always going to be working on you. It's never going to go away. Sorry. I wish it were true, but anyway. Because, I walked into church like, this will make my life better. And it did. But then, like, I just kind of sat there and was like, all right. Thanks, God. Where's my thing? Right? Why won't this just go away? I've been praying for it. Someone said this was going to happen. So, occasionally, I find biblical verses to use, if you wouldn't believe it, because it's usually not my forte. But we have some highlights of it on your slide behind me, right? Thank you. And I'm going to read the fullness of it for a purpose. So it's 1 Corinthians 2:10-16. So the Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, explaining spiritual realities with Spirit-taught words. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. The person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgments. For who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we understand these things, for we have the mind of Christ. So what got me reading the whole thing was that it's Spirit, 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 Spirit the whole time, right? And then we culminate with mind of Christ. I was like, well, there's a relationship I hadn't really considered, right? That to have a mind of Christ, I need to engage in the Spirit of God, but also that they are completely interdependent, right? It's easy for us to separate these things, right? That the three that is one is more separate because it's easier to explain or talk about or engage your gift set or things like that, right? But why it makes no sense is because it's full. It's one thing. So I felt slightly validated for my, again, not being the most emotionally run man on the planet, right? Like, my mind is what I lean on the most. I feel in my chest and I process in my head, right? Some of us have different processes and they're valid, but for me, this is how it goes. And then I often bump into a separation of ideas, right? That like, it's only faith, right? And that faith is the only thing. This is of man, so it's over here and not as valuable. And yet I find these spiritual principles that are true everywhere. And in this very verse, the Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. And who knows their thoughts best other than their own spirit? And then it's, right? Nothing knows the thoughts of God other than the Spirit of God. Okay. So Jesus was like, hey, if you say you believe in me, like I'm going to reside in you so that my spirit will be with you. Okay. And he knows God. And then my spirit knows me best. Okay. And they're talking to each other. So maybe these two things need to like work together for me, and I need to understand myself the most. Otherwise, I cannot discern between the two. Right? So if I'm going to have the mind of Christ, that comes with an understanding of who I am, an acceptance of who I am. I only get there with vulnerability. So on the next slide, I have the mind of Christ as an opportunity to see the Father as Christ sees him, then how the Father sees Christ, which ultimately is how he sees you. I used to hear things like that. I'm like, that's nice. I have a dad now. You know what I mean? Like, I simplified it a lot, and I didn't take on the understanding that there's a process that I join in. rather than just believe that I'm being seen a specific way, if I participate in my change and if I participate in what this says, I actually then change. So I feel like it's important to mention that because, again, there are absolutely miraculous power moves of God, and then there is I can stop finally from a place of peace and see miracles, or someone else sees it, right? And I had no idea it was going on. Like, you've been faithful. I was like, have I? Thank you for saying so. Because in my head, I had one foot in this thing, and the other foot was ready to just be like, I'm done. You know, my identity became in question. And there's a good reason why, right? So, if our spirit is seeking truth, and the Holy Spirit is also seeking that truth within us, stands to reason then that with that indwelling, we have this supernatural aid, and that's the only way we get to the mind of Christ. So, I'm going to bring us back to our friend Phil again. And Phil takes this Jungian philosophy, right, as an old psychotherapeutic guy, right? Big guy in the field, right? There's always somebody who spends their whole life thinking about a few things, and then it becomes their life's work, and then we get like a little snippet of it and judge it like crazy. But there is one thing he talks about that's incredibly important, and it's the shadow, right? And I bumped into this even in Christian realms, like what exists in psychotherapy for like what's analogous, and other than the Enneagram, it's like I've heard people talk about shadow work. And if the shadow is as simply as Phil Stutz puts it, was I believe it to be, right? Because rather than us all be scholars on one guy, we just take this guy's reiteration of it, which is the shadow appears as the sum total of the weakest, most flawed, inferior, or even disgusting parts of yourself. Right? So for me, I read that and I go, oh, sinful nature, human nature, right? All of the things that make us completely different from Jesus, right? The things that make him the example, we all have the rest of this in common. External validation won't soothe that shadow, right? This is an important thing because what I don't like about myself, I project the opposite forward, right? So as long as someone gives me a pat on the old back and says, good job, I'm supposed to be okay. Except self-soothing takes the form of like hits of dopamine and other things, right? It's my penchant for a lot of coffee. It's cookies. And the list gets far worse as we continue, right? And I'm not free of having partaken in those either. If you do know me, you know where I come from. So the thing is external validation is ultimately meaningless, except if I don't know me, I don't know how I need to be validated, right? And if I don't know me, I can't differentiate Jesus. So I can get years down the line and never experience any of the promises that people talk about around me or the songs we sing say or what God tells me when I look at the Bible, right? Because it's just all one big mishmash, and I'm just plugging holes trying to move forward, which has a short shelf life. This is what we call burnout, right? Like, I'm done, I'm out. So it takes an immense amount of vulnerability to engage the parts of yourself you find disgusting. And I'm talking about the ones you don't utter around. You know those thoughts, right? You're like, oh, God, where did that? Woof. And you stuff it, right? And rightfully so, right? Without any tools, that's a terrifying thing. But it's the same thing that has you go, how does God allow these things to happen? How does man perpetrate these crimes and sins against each other? Well, it's this, right? You have to befriend this thing. You have to understand it, right? We like our light and dark analogies in Christianity, so here it is. We have Jesus as light. We have a microphone that won't stay on my ear in the appropriate spot, right? But then we have all that we are afraid to say we are, all the things we wish we weren't, and all of like the darkest little electrical impulses in our brain that make you go, what was that? And then whatever's been created in us that we can then have to sift through, right? So how do I expect Jesus to be light in the darkness as an extension of my faith if I am not allowing his light to touch the darkness in me. And I can only do that if I present it. And in this, the Spirit knows all things. It's already known. I'm the only one who's hiding it, and I'm only protecting myself. Now, that doesn't mean stand up here and scream your traumas out, right? Like, doesn't mean, just don't, you don't have to, I'm not the model, per se. You can, I've said some things up here, and I can do that because I processed it in a way that allows me to feel relatively safe. I could tell you a full trauma narrative and feel almost nothing because I'm just used to saying it. There is a deeper truth to speaking out that thing. But the acceptance of it, and that's what Jesus offered me, was I'm going to help you make sense of this. And that's why I'm a therapist. So if you were ever in a session with me for the first time, I'm going to say, I'm just a guy who got a degree. It happens to be in line with how I've been created, and it took me 30-something years to figure out what that actually looks like. And then, in a very selfish attempt to have the bad things that have happened to me make sense, I decided to help other people with it, because otherwise, I'm lost. I'm just spinning on a rock really fast in a universe that is apparently ever expanding, and I'm lost in an existential cloud and crisis for eternity, right? So the only thing that works is the application of that. I was only able to do that because of God and the Spirit, right? And a model. So there's so many layers that I really want to address all this stuff on, right? Like there's am I okay? It's like, no, I'm not. Is that okay? Yeah. Are you okay? Maybe, maybe not. It's also okay. Are we collectively as a church okay? No, right? No, because this thing scales, right? It scales on up. And you want to go out and share Jesus. And they're like, what about this? You're like, and you just get defensive and fall back to a posture that is not loving, right? That like, well, no, what I know is true, that I read. It's the only thing that's true, and you're an idiot. But you should come to church on Sunday because it's a really cool place. And here we go. And now, and I'm going to leave it there because then I dive into a deeper pool, which is another conversation. But the reality is when things get overwhelmingly complicated, all you can do is like torch the things that are complicated and back up and reassess, right? So assess the why behind the what. But if you didn't do the work for the initial push of why, if you never did that, it's all a huge mess. The only thing you can do is come back and look at it. So how do I do the things that God's asked me to do while managing the tension of being a quarter as good at this as it might appear to the casual observer and still be effective in like the kingdom? And it's because I know my shadow and I accept what it is, right? And loving this process is just starting for me. And it could be because I work with it that I lose energy to use it on myself. But the reality is it's not ever going to stop for any of us. None of this is static. None of this is stationary. There is no arrival moment. And if you're waiting for an arrival moment and a promise, if you're living for eternity, are you living now at all? Or are you just like locking yourself in a closet and hedging your bets and hope you get there okay? Because Jesus still did a whole bunch of stuff before the inevitable death he knew was coming, right? So we have this and now. And psychology mirrors this, right? We have this moment to be effective in. We have this moment to be honest in. We have this moment to make a different choice based off of what we have been and who we are. And that's the only way we do anything different going forward, except, my anxiety and my desire to have finished tasks and stuff like that says I can make that happen. And you sometimes can, and then you're all validated. You're like, yeah, look. Or you need to reevaluate the processes you're in, right? Because it's another Stoic principle. If you're only focused on the goal, why are you doing this? Because you're going to spend more time in the process than you are at the end of it. So aligning, understanding, shaking hands with your shadow is the only way you turn into a shriveled old version of yourself that you don't have to fear, right? And that can only be done in trusted spaces, right? It's like, hey, everybody, tell everybody a deep, dark, horrible thing you think, right? And I'm not talking about the misfirings of your brain that just have random stuff happen. I'm talking about the stuff that you know is from elsewhere, the impulse to do something you know is terrible, right? It stays that big if you pretend it's not there. If you just keep trying to keep it in the dark, then it also, in turn, gets no interaction with the light that we say we now carry. So, till I'm done ever having a microphone in front of me, I'm going to harp upon the importance of self-knowledge. And it sounds like taking power back from God, or it sounds like, well, but no, he's totally baked it into the process. He made you, so you're not an idiot, right? You understand this? Like, if he made you that way, you're aligning with him by spending time understanding yourself. It is not selfish. It is not a pursuit. You need to do it. Or you don't, because you're okay where you're at. I don't know. Am I okay? I'd argue it's better not to be, right? Because when I have no faith, and when I can't find God, and then everything crushes underneath me, and I'm left in a pile, I go, oh, there he is, right? When I'm like not proud enough to ask for help, and I get it, and I'm like, I wouldn't have thought that person would have done that for me. And they're like, everything I was afraid of in that question was just like, of course, right? And there's people in this room who have been the people who've done that thing. And you don't do that without getting vulnerable. If I don't expose the things I'm afraid of, if I don't expose what I think, people are going to think about me based off of what I'm doing or not doing. That's it. So at the 9:30, I was worshiping and, doing the Build My Life thing and sitting there, and I missed it. And I told you about the misting, right? It's a serious thing. So, and like, what was it? It was like, well, this whole process of doing this was also about me, because I've put some flimsy things on my foundation too, right? Because it's easy to forget the process, or it's easy to become overwhelmed and run through. And the overwhelming feeling I have is like, it's okay, right? Because I can't understand grace from God. I can't understand mercy from God. And I can't, quite frankly, understand forgiveness from people in my life, let alone from people who know my shadow and what he's capable of. Because he ran the show for a long time. I don't get that intellectually, but I just have to try and receive it. That's my job, right? The only thing I can do is try to receive it. And that's been a constant effort, and I think people here would think the same, right? It's a constant trying. So when there comes to these like tips and next steps for this whole thing, there are many various steps from various fields of people who are brilliant and thought about things. And you've heard them all before, you've seen them in other places, but they will not work unless you are being considered as an individual with somebody whose goal is to help understand what that might be, right? Another thing I'll say is, like, I just take a bunch of stuff and throw it at the wall, and what sticks is what I continue to work with somebody, right? I have no idea, but I can see their eyes shift when I make a suggestion on a coping skill. I can see their attention grab when I mention some concept, right? And that's being logged in my brain as part of the path to take. People can't do that for you if you're not actually vulnerable, if you're not honest, if you don't admit that, like, hey, I say I believe in this guy, and then, like, most of the time I don't, right? Hey, like, I want to be this, and I'm not anywhere near it. And I'm not even talking about the perfect goal, because that's the carrot we do not touch right now. It's a guidepost in what we drive towards, but even my best conceptualization of myself, I'm nowhere near it, right? And I may not even get there, but I'll work towards it, and I have to accept that I'm going to mess up in this process. It's not going to go well, right? I could spend 90 days operating as like a suboptimal person, right? None of the things that are good for me happen. None of the things I prefer happen. None of it. None of the coping skills I identified that work, and I have a coping skill and a backup coping skill, and none of them are doing it. And that is all I'm capable of doing. But what I always know is true through my own experience and knowing myself is that I will hit a point where this stops. It will pass. I will survive, and I will be okay. My job is to take that okay, reassess, how can I do this better or not, and then hand it over and try to experience something better, right? I can't stand up here and tell you what your individual threshold for these things are, So when I think of a few things and how to finish this up, one thing that came up, Phil Stutz also said, true confidence is living in uncertainty. Which, again, seems so simple to me, but I'm like, oh, yeah, right? Uncertainty, acceptance of not knowing. If I'm always in that posture, I just get more and more comfortable with that posture, right? And the more I'm in it, the more I'm actually present, the more I'm in the day I'm walking through, and I don't have to constantly force myself into states of being present. I just am because I'm left with no other option. In those old notes, and I'll bring this up, I wrote down this whole thing about how like people perceive other people, right? And this church has shifted, so a lot of people don't know the guy who walked in. You know, some do. It is wildly different. And the error is that we all consent to it's always good, that there's something different there, right? My life is beautiful, and it's not perfect, right? And it's easy to take two people doing a thing together, right? Me and my wife, and look how far, look how far Ryan's come, and this and that. In that, what we have is born out of a constant theme of being at our wits' end and out of options. And so all we do is just do the thing that we think we're supposed to, or the thing that we're being led to do, right? It's born out of a need. It's not like a good laid plan. It's just like, this seems right. Okay, like, do you have time to think about this? I don't, you know? Even when we got married, it was like, all right, we got no time, so we don't have to make any decisions. It's like, this person was great next, this person was great next, and then I was getting married. It was like that. And there's a lesson in, like, planning and considering options versus just doing, and being okay with whatever the consequences might be. Because I can live with my own choices when I've done my own work, right? Whether it fails or not, if I've done the work of knowing me as best as I can in this moment and staying honest and connecting with the people who I trust, who are around me, I'm fine with messing up. I'm fine with failing because I did it. Nobody told me to do it. I didn't fall victim to circumstances or what life expected of me. It's because I'm not pretending to be things I'm not all the time. Sometimes I am. And that's okay too, right? You got a job. You got to turn off this, that, and this thing to go do your job, right? Like, and for me, that's even higher sometimes because I'm a therapist, so I'm supposed to be a bunch of things. But when that can't be hidden, I have to just like be a little honest about it, right? Because people are smart and they intuit things and be like, sorry, man, today's been a day. How are you? You know, like, give me a second. I'm just taking a moment, right? So there's a balance between the projection of what we'd like to be, the false front that we put up, or not. I can't judge what those things are for you. I can only do that for myself. So what do we do with all of this? And like, in a nice little thing where it's not me, is be like Simon Peter, right? Because I was like, is there anything biblically I can tie this with? Because otherwise I'm just going to finish on like my own psychotherapy stuff and my own private story. And so for me, it was important to highlight a thing that like, it's similar to Doug's story, right? Like, we get to hear a nice version of it. And it's like, wow, what a miracle. We didn't have to like almost die 3 times and all this, right? We didn't have to walk that thing out. We all have our versions of this stuff. And they're in the Bible. It's just not the most narratively dense book you're ever going to read, right? They don't like start telling you the feelings that so-and-so is having. Like, time passes in like 2 verses, and you're like, oh, cool, 1,000 years. Let's move on. So the same can be true when you get something from someone like me or a pastor or whoever telling you a curated story for a point. And I was like, everybody in the Bible to me is a character that displays some subsection of human brokenness, right? With the exception of Jesus. There's only one that stands apart. So I thought of Simon Peter. And I cared about his split name because he's first called and given a new name, right? And then like he's full of faith and he steps out on water, right? And then he's boastful and prideful. He's violent. He's chopping ears off. He doesn't listen to Jesus half the time, right? Then he denies and betrays Jesus at the very end, right? Now, Jesus called him out and gave him a new name, knowing all of this. He didn't live up to that name till after Jesus died, and Peter was completely broken by what he had done and saw his shadow very, very clearly, maybe for the first time. And then he becomes the Peter that you see later on. I mean, arguably other things happen. But, he's used as a model for leadership, right? Upon you, I build my church. Yet he's the guy who, was an all-star quarterback in high school, but actually didn't play, right? He's the, you know what I mean? He was just boastful, and I would never, ever deny you, my Lord. No, 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 no. And it's like, yes, 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 right? And he couldn't stay awake when asked, basic, hey, man, stay awake. I'm going to go pray. And he couldn't even do that. Right? I tried to think of this in terms of identity and the process that we are all jumping into by showing up to church. And it's like we walk in, I'm like, oh, cool. I can be saved just by X, Y, and Z. That's pretty great, right? I'm saved. I'm a believer. I get qualified for something I can't even wrap my brain around. Why do I still think this? Why do I still feel this? Why isn't that better? Why do I see this? What's going on? And what gets built up is that, people have been here a while, so they know what's going on. It's like, no, we don't, right? We know some things. Some people know some things. And the people who know themselves understand that they are different things. Not everyone will be the mouth, the hands, the eyes, right? In the body of Christ, you can't even figure out where you belong without knowing who you are in that process. But you'll never experience anything Jesus promises either, and the things that attracted you to him will dry up unless you engage and actively participate. So it's another cognitively dissonant truth. I'm going to surrender, and then through that somehow I get power. And our, those of us and the people in here who have done some support groups, 12-step type things, more intimately get that truth, but it's a harder one to really wrap your head around. So I'm going to let this go, and I get it back in a different way. That's mine, but not mine at the same time. I can never navigate that without knowing all of the horrible things I'm capable of, and also then I have to know the good, right? So it's not just knowing your shadow. Let's say your shadow ran the show for 2 decades or more. You have to also be open to hear what's okay and what's good about you, right? That's what humility is, seeing yourself as you are, not pride in reverse and not pridefully. And I think Peter makes a good example of that. And there's a lot of permission and acceptance. Because remember, Jesus called him and did all these things, knowing exactly what he was going to do. And the Spirit of God knows all things. And then it comes in next to you, and your spirit knows you better than the other one. So you're already accepted. You're already loved and forgiven. So why would we agonize over every little thing and our failings and our shortcomings and measuring ourselves against others? You have to know yourself to do this better. So be like him, but be like yourself, right? I say be like him because there's just permission in it. And he's all over the place, right? And I mentioned this earlier, but Peter and Judas, no different, except Peter was repentant. And when Peter was broken, he wanted to be put back together differently, right? He wanted to do different with what he had become. And that, he didn't go, well, this person did that to me 5 years ago, and that's why I'm like this now. All that is true. He's human, so let's assume there's a whole bunch of things that helped create the stuff that he didn't like about himself. Also, it wasn't about them. It was about him and changing, because with the knowledge that we engage in, right? When we do psychotherapy, you're now you're on the line for it. Eventually, you hit a spot where you've done it for a while and you understand kind of enough to go, okay, I can't blame that on mom and dad or this one or that one. I know. Now I'm the only one who can do anything with that. And then here, we have to go, now I'm the only one who can do that with Jesus, right? So the invitation is there. If anything here has stuck, this is the best next tip I can get. If any one thing of all my constant ideas is, if it hit you in a certain type of way, just grab that one. And that's the only one you got to worry about for now, because it's not me. You heard something. Your own self is responding to an idea or a concept. That's what you hold on to. And take it wherever you need to. Some of us maybe are in therapy. Some of us are not. Some of us are engaging in things for our overall well-being. And if you are, you bring it there. And if you're not, maybe it's God inviting you to do that. I'm going to wrap it up because I was like, I'm not going to go as long. And I just did it again. It wasn't the computer's fault either. So, some may want to get some prayer. If that's the case, some prayer people will come forward. I too will. I usually don't do it after the mental health thing because, like, I feel like people are going to be uncomfortable with it. But this isn't just like that, right? This is a different thing. It's more holistic. It's more a total view of yourself. And if you feel like God's moving in that and you feel like you need some prayer just to reinforce it or to speak to it, come forward. For everybody else who feels like they need to go somewhere and the sun's out, we're going to do that. Hey, thanks. Nice. See? So, for those of you going, let's just pray really quick. So, Holy Spirit, we thank you. We thank you that you know the heart of the Father and that you would gift us with that knowledge. And God, we thank you for wisdom that's both ancient and wisdom that is new. We thank you that we can do a thing like this together, that we can come together in community where we show up as just different individuals and we can become a thing that we call a community or a church, and we can have safety here. So God, I pray that you would continue to guide us, encourage us, inspire us, and heal us. In your name we pray. Amen. Have a great rest of the day, guys.